I want to share with you this morning from Second Corinthians chapter 5, just dovetailing off of a lot of what he had to say. One thing's for sure, I think I get from his story, and I think I get from the Bible, is that when Jesus Christ comes into your life, life will never be the same. It doesn't mean it'll necessarily be easy, as Josh talked about, but it will not be the same. And when you get a hold of Jesus Christ, and more importantly, when Jesus Christ gets a hold of you, life is going to be different. It can be exciting. It can be scary. It can be a whole vast array of things. But the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 talks about some changes that happen when we have Christ as an active part of our life. Look with me in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 14 and following. We're going to kind of dive into the scripture over the next couple of weeks, and we're just going to look at some key changes that take place in our lives. In your bulletin, if you're here, there's an outline. Feel free to grab that out if you want to make some notes. And this first bullet point, if you will, please forgive me, grammarians and teachers. I don't believe this is proper English or etiquette, but this is what I've got because I had to have a rhyming B and P, okay? When Christ comes into our lives, the first thing that will happen is you will live life with a bolder or more bold, a bolder passion. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14 and verse 15. It's interesting. He mentions two key facets. If you want to enjoy a happy life, if you want to enjoy a fulfilled life, if you want to enjoy a successful life, he mentions two key things that I think are foundational to grasp a hold of and to get a hold of if we're going to be able to do that. He talks about our compelling why we live life, and how we live life. Look at verse 14. He says, "For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died." Let's go ahead and read verse 15. "And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and also was raised for them." The first thing I find in verse 14, if you want to have a life that is filled with passion, is this. You've got to understand what your compelling why is. You've got to understand why you're living life, and you've got to understand how you're living life. Look what he says. He says, Christ's love compels us. He understood his compelling why. He understood why he was on the planet. He understood what he was living for. And that's one of the reasons I wanted Josh to share. God has worked in his life, and it's sometimes a journey, and it's a process. And I love how he shared. It's just the third chapter. I mean, it's never finished. When you're done growing, you're done. And so it's an ongoing process. He says, but Christ's love compels us. Paul knew what his compelling why was. He knew why he was here. He told the Philippians, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." The Apostle John says we love because he first loved us. So they understood their compelling why. And when you understand your compelling why, you'll be convinced. Look what he says. We're compelled by Christ's love because we are convinced that one died for all. He's talking about Jesus, and therefore all died. Rather interesting theological concepts in that. I'm not going to dive into that. I'd encourage you to read a commentary. You'll really learn some interesting theological ideas from that last phrase of that verse. But let me ask you a question. Why are you here? I'm not talking just a church. I'm talking about why are you here? Why are you on this planet? What is your compelling why? You know, so often we get busy with life, we don't ever even stop to ask ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing? We get on the treadmill and we get on the rat wheel and we just are running. Why are you here? Well, I'm here because I have to work. I hope your compelling why is broader and more exciting than just work. I know you have to work. It's like the old song, I owe, so off to work I go. Huh? Why are you here? Are you here just to work? Are you living to work, or are you working to live? What is your reason for being? Why are you here? Have you ever stopped and asked, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why do I spend so much time in the activities and the things that I'm involved in? Why? What is our compelling why? Folks, if we want to be effective, we have to understand our compelling why. The Apostle Paul was incredibly effective. He wrote 3/4 of the New Testament. He started church after church after church. He discipled person after person after person. Why? Because he knew why he was here. He had a compelling why. It's interesting. I'd encourage you to talk to Josh a little more, how God guided his journey and what he now does. He didn't get into it greatly or to a great extent, but his job's a really fascinating job. And why he got into that job and what exactly he does now and how God guided that process for him. It's phenomenal what he's doing. And he's doing that because he loves what he does. He felt he was called to do what he does. He makes these medical devices that help people who are crippled. He has this printer that they build these things and they make these medical instruments. It's kind of fascinating. It intrigues me. But he just felt like God has wired him to do that. God's designed him to do that. That he feels like that's what he's called to do, and that's what God's gifted him to do. And so he does that, and he does it with passion because he loves what he does. Somebody said, I like Simon Sinek, he says, working hard for something we don't care about, that's called stress. Working hard for something you love is called passion. Somebody said, make your passion your profession, and you'll never work a day in your life. I just love that. Why are you here? Why do you do what you do? What is your compelling why? When you understand your why, then you will have conviction. And when you have a conviction, then you'll be able to be committed to whatever that why is because you know why you're here. You're convinced you're supposed to do it, and you'll be committed to the cause, and things won't deflect you from that cause. So that's the why. Another key aspect of passion, I believe, in life is to understand how we live. Look at verse 15. He says, He died for all so that those who live, he's talking about us, should no longer live for themselves, but for Him who died for them. Isn't it interesting to you? We live in America, and folks, we have more to make us happy and joy-filled than ever before, don't we? I mean, folks, we've got Google. I grew up without Google. Hello. We have more to make us happy. I just upgraded my iPhone to the new operating system. There's an app for everything out there. We have so many things at our fingertips. We got so many luxuries. We've got great cars with great air conditioning. We've got so much to make us happy. And yet Americans are experiencing epidemic levels of stress, anxiety, depression, and unhappiness. Why is that? Why do you think that is? Now, I'm going to give a rather simplistic answer. And I know it's not the full answer. There's probably 14 causes to that. But could it be that in part, one of the causes is that we're living by ourselves? Statistics tell us that. Americans used to know their neighbors. Americans had a sense of community in their neighborhood. And now they call it the cocooning of America. We're connected socially, but we're disconnected relationally. We have friends on Facebook, but we have no friends in our families or in our neighborhoods or in our workplaces. We're disconnected. We're doing it by ourselves. And I think also as Americans, we've bought into this materialistic concept. We bought into this please yourself, and we're doing it for ourselves. And look what he says here in verse 15. He says, those who live should no longer live for themselves. And I think so many Americans, they're living for them. It's all about what they need and what they have to have and how they get along. And we get disconnected from the larger community, from one another. And it's all about my needs and my job and my house and my car and my schedule and me. Everything's instant and I've got to have it and I've got to have it now. And we're losing a sense of community. We're losing some togetherness. And I think that's what makes the church such a great thing in society, because we have groups in church, we have classes in church, we have ministries where we can serve together and work together and get to know one another. We need to learn to live not just for ourselves. We need to learn to live not just for our work, but we need to learn to live for a greater reason. And I think that greater reason is other people. I think the book of Philippians says it well. He says, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. What attitude is that? The verse prior to that tells us. It says, do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. You see, I think we're more fulfilled. I think we're more happy. I think life is more meaningful when we begin to understand that we've been put here for a reason, and that reason is to add value, to bless others. When it's always self-seeking, when we're always trying to get for us, and it's always trying to bless ourselves, then it diminishes us. And we weren't made to do that. God wired us to be a blessing to other people. And the more that you bless other people, the more you begin to realize this is where the real joy is. And I'm reminded of that every year. I go back at least once to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And we've been doing this for over 25 years. And I go on a mission trip. We have several churches down there, and we go down. It's called Heralding Haiti. And we work with several churches. And, I never go down there, but what I come back, and it reorients me. It recalibrates my attitude. Because I go down there, and I see people who don't have running water. And all I have to do is turn on the tap. I see a country with one road, like with real pavement, and it's got a lot of potholes. And to get anywhere, it takes you 3 hours, and it's the bumpiest ride you ever had in the back end of a pickup truck. I need a chiropractor when I get back. And I go down there, and one of our preachers, his name is Jude. And he'd been writing us about how his wife had been sick quite a lot. And we got down there, and we could tell she'd lost some weight. And when we got to the church, he had done a lot of added construction on the church building. And we knew that we had not sent any money to help him do that. And we're like, Jude, how did you do this? And he said, I took my salary. They were going without food, literally, for days on end, so he could buy cement to build blocks on his church building. I don't know about you, but that humbled me. I thought, man, what do I have to cry about? I've never had to go without a meal or multiple meals. And it reminded me, I'm not just here for me. I don't just have to drive a new car. I need to help a guy like Jude, who's being a blessing to people. And what a blessing he is. I think number two, when you get Jesus Christ, I think you gain a broader perspective. I'm reading this from the NLT version, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 16. He says, so we have stopped evaluating others from a human point of view. Some translations say, we have stopped judging others according to the flesh. In other words, he's saying, we don't judge people, we don't look at people, we don't evaluate people based on externals. It's man who looks on the outward appearance, but it's God who looks at the heart. I like this verse, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 16. His purpose, God's purpose, was to create him in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. And I just thought these verses were appropriate in light of all that's happened in our city and in our area over the last several weeks. His goal was to make in one body, to reconcile both of them to God through the cross. Now, we know he's talking about Jews and Gentiles here. But you see, our culture and our society is not the first to be rocked by social injustice and by prejudice and by racism. They had it back then. And God says that he wants to reconcile people. He wants to bring people together. And that was a huge issue. The Jews and the Gentiles, they didn't get along. They threw rocks at each other. They hated each other. If you study history, you'll find that when they traveled, the Jews, rather than going through the Gentile country, they would cross over the Jordan, go up north, and then cross back over. It was several days extra travel because they didn't want to travel through where the Samaritans and the Gentiles lived. That's how much hatred there was between these two groups. And now you've got Christianity coming to bear, and you've got people coming to Christ, and some are Jewish and some are Gentile. And guess what? They're all a part of the church. And now you got probably the group over here and the group over here, and they're not. How do you deal with that? And God says, hey, my goal is that there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. We're all one in Christ Jesus. I believe God's people are people who promote peace and reconciliation. As a matter of fact, we'll get into more of this next week, but you'll see that word reconciliation or reconcile or reconciled. That word occurs 5 different times in these 7 verses. And I would encourage you, when you go home today, read 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 14 to 21, and just underline the word reconcile, reconciliation, or reconciled, and see how many times and how it applies and what God is calling us as his people to, as Christian believers, to be reconciled with him. Last of all, and I'll conclude with this. Look at verse 17. I'm not going to dive into it, but I just want you to kind of hear this verse, the Living Bible version of it. When someone becomes a Christian, he becomes a brand new person inside. He is not the same anymore. A new life has begun. When you get a hold of who Jesus Christ is, and more importantly, when Jesus Christ gets a hold of you, life will never be the same. You become a whole new person on the inside. I'm going to talk about that in depth next week. I want to close with this idea, verse 20. It simply says in verse 20, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. There's that word, reconciled. He says, we implore you. It's interesting. Several different translations translate that in a different way. Some say, we urge you. We implore you. We beseech you. We urgently request of you. And all of those ideas are inherent in this original Greek word. One translation even uses the word, we beg you. We beg you. Be reconciled to God. You know, after the events of the last few weeks, I think it's obvious we live in a world that needs to experience reconciliation. And that happens not through political means, although that can help, not through social means, although there's a lot of value there as well. But I believe the true answer is through a spiritual means, and that's through Jesus Christ. I don't know where you are in your journey. Maybe you're just starting the journey. And like Josh, maybe instead of in chapter 3, you're